What do you want to talk about today?
Well, I think in kind of as we've been going through the various phases of developing, of implementing projects, now why don't we talk about closing out a project today?
That's a good idea.
I don't think I don't think we've ever talked about project closeout.
No, we haven't. Even though we have these different methodologies now that we didn't have, it's pretty consistent. Every project has a closure.
It does, but let me tell you, I want to start off by talking about it from a contractor's perspective, because I spent most of my career, over 40 years, on the system integration side. Actually, over 30 years on the system integration side, where we were contractors for hire, develop, implement, manage for a while, and then leave. And so a lot of times when it dealt with things like project closure, here's what's interesting from a contractor's perspective versus, say, inside the corporate IT service team. But what we found was a lot of times our clients didn't want to pay for the additional time it would take to do a proper closeout. And so what we would find ourselves doing, a lot of times we would do it for ourselves because we wanted to improve our ability. But a lot of times our clients didn't get the full benefit of what we could do for a full closeout report because they thought it was a project, one off. We don't have to learn anything. We're gone. Goodbye. We don't want to pay you. That kind of thing. So,
right.
So it's an interesting dichotomy, I think, between that and an internal IT house.
Yes. I assume also because you're under contract, there's a huge amount of governance and compliance, and it's a lot more formal too.
Well, it is. And a lot of the closeout, I guess they think that a lot of the closeout is once you've implemented, and then we stick around and do hypercare and some maintenance and operations for a little while until we can transition. I guess a lot of times they believe that that is their closeout. And for us, we would often do our own internal closeout so that we could continue to benefit from the learnings from that last project.
See, this is what I learned as a consultant as well. There's a closure you, as the provider of services or products, have to do. There's a closure you have to do with your client. And it's the same way on the other side of the project, the other side of the row of books. Basically, there's an internal approval that you as a provider of service products have to do. And so with that in mind, if we're just talking about closure, yeah, it's a double whammy there because you have all these requirements and policies and decisions you have to make both within your company as well as, at the service of another.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'll tell you what I did do though, when I hung up my own shingle and went on my own as consulting to organizations, there's a fairly large Midwestern state government department brought me on to help them with their request for proposal, with their, the whole procurement process, and then stay on to manage the system integrator that won the bid. So during that time, during the procurement time, I had the opportunity to talk to their IT staff and say, I think we should put something in the budget for our system integrators, whoever wins this project, to actually do a proper what we called in those days was project implementation evaluation report, a peer report. And that was essentially a lessons learned, a closeout report. But we put the money in the budget and requested that every bidder bid to that task as well. So in that case, we ended up getting a proper, true closeout by the system integrator.
Yeah, and it's funny when we talk about closeout, every organization and every corporate culture has their own idea. And many companies think it's just the transition of deliverable. And many companies think, no, it's like what you talked about. It's the hypercare, it's the warranty, it's the validation that we have stability once the item is transitioned.
And selfishly, it's the lessons learned.
Yes. Yes, indeed. So here's the thing. Let's start off with with some ground discussion, a little context. What are the things you focus on first when you're addressing a project closure? What are the first things that pop in your mind and you know you need to take care of?
Well, one of the first things I do is the final lessons learned process. Again, we don't want anybody leaving. Here's the thing with contractors. The minute you're finished, you want to get that body onto the next project, because if you're sitting on the bench, you're not making money for the company, right? So
Right.
we want to be able to do the closeout while we still have people on the ground on the project, still billing to this project. And so therefore, one of the first things I do, or one of the most important things I deal with, is that lessons learned document. We want to capture it, all of the ideas, so that we can go to our next projects, and I'll say plural, with those lessons learned.
Excellent.
That's one thing. There's many. How about yourself?
The same. Number two, I like to compartmentalize. I have different phases of the closure. I have the closure that has to do with the deliverable. I have the closure that has to do with the resources. I have the closures to do with the innovations, the lessons learned. I have the closure that has to do with finance. And primarily, I break it down into two major groups of work. It's the deliverables transition and its stability, and it's the administrative closure of the project. It's capturing the documents and archiving them and getting the knowledge to where it needs to be. And that includes communicating to the rest of the organizations.
Yeah, and sometimes, and you mentioned before that some of the projects that I dealt with dealt a lot with regulations and that sort of thing. In those situations, we also had to take care of the final contractual deliverables to show that we in fact did complete and were authorized to bill the last set of invoices. So that obviously, maybe I should have said that was first before lessons learned, because obviously the company wants to get paid. But yeah, it's all that ticking and tying of all of the different loose ends, perhaps, that can still be hanging around at project end, so that they're all closed out properly.
Yeah, indeed. And this is one thing I've observed, that the project closure is not just a bunch of actions and activities you do at the end of the project. Some of the closing of the project happens throughout the whole life, like closing contracts, like finalizing payments, like releasing my human and physical resources, right? That's something that you do, if you're tidy and if you're organized, you're doing this closing activity throughout the life of the project. So best case scenario, the end of the project is just an administrative action of checklist. Did I do that? Yep, everything's in place. Good. I'm done.
Well, I think in one of our discussions, you had mentioned that right from project initiation, you're already starting project closure.
Yes. It's just like being in sports. The first step on the track when you're racing is the first step towards winning. And it's the same thing with this. It's in restaurant in the restaurant industry. They have a concept called mise en place, everything in its place, so that you're able to think and behave as if everything is where you last put it. And then the closing is making sure that everything you're done with is returned and cleaned. Now, this is necessary in restaurant business so that you can work fast. Why don't we just apply that in our project environment too, so that we have everything in its place in the way we need it? And if we're applying lessons learned, guess what? It's better than what we came with. So we're continually improving and everything's ready at a moment's notice.
You sound like you've been watching my wife and I in the kitchen after I retired. It seems like I don't put things back in the same place that she gets them from.
See, that's where consensus comes in.
Yeah, exactly. And so speaking of this, we kind of understand the focus of addressing project closure. But what do you think are some of the items that people miss out on or just ignore when they're closing out a project?
It's the little items. And it's always the little items that are important. You know, recognizing the team members who are rolling off the project and really working with them. It's not just a nice to have. It's not just something that says, oh, I'm being nice to this person. It's sitting down and talking with them and pulling any other valuable lessons learned from them before they leave the office. Yes, it takes time. And it's also necessary.
You know, one of the things, one of the corporations that I worked for implemented something that I thought was fantastic. You know, when we do staff reviews for their annual increments or whatever it is, right? At one point, we were doing staff reviews at 6 months and then at the annual basis. We also introduced staff reviews at the end of every project. And what that helped us was from a project manager's perspective, who has led this particular person for 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, perhaps. That person knows the person being evaluated the best at that moment. And so therefore can do a really sound evaluation. And that really helped us understand, first of all, who was truly producing. But secondly, it also kept our employees on track in terms of their career goals. Because if they knew they were being evaluated at the end of every project, or sometimes at the end of every major phase, they knew that they would be working harder to make sure that that evaluation was a good one. And so I think that's one that's often missed and that we implemented that worked for us.
That and again, you know, you can have that conversation at the end of the project, but what if you have an ongoing relationship with that team member's functional or operational manager, and you're just able to talk even like 15 minutes a month and say, hey, I have 2 of your engineers here. Would you like me to give you feedback on them on a regular basis? Or also at the same time talking to the team members and say, hey, you know, let's make sure that your work and your efforts here are visible to your organization so that you get the recognition you deserve.
That was always important to me, even as an employee, because I worked my entire career in matrixed organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result of that, my line manager might not know what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis unless they got that feedback from my project manager. So yeah, that's what you just said is exactly right.
And again, it's often missed because in the hustle and bustle, we're getting these basics, you know, out of the way and keeping them balanced in the air. And if we really do approach delegation in the proper way, you know, wouldn't it be nice if we could handle a lot of these day-to-day things as, you know, team member, you're smart. You guys are doing that. Just keep me in the loop, and I'll sit down with you once a week and make sure that you have the skills you need to do this. And they'll give me a chance to make some phone calls throughout the week and help you out as well.
Well, and the other thing is, you know, I always had the roll-off schedule for each staff person. So you knew it's not like suddenly, surprise, I'm leaving tomorrow. No, you've got this roll-off schedule for a while. And at the end of the project, everyone rolls off onto the next assignment. So there is time to build that into your own personal schedule to make sure that that is not missed at project closure time.
But it always takes a proactive nature to take advantage of that.
Well, it does, because it's not the invoice, right?
That's right.
The invoice obviously takes the first priority when it comes to closing out a project.
So we talked about what we think people miss. What are the things that we can do to make project closure easy for us?
Well, and this is a good question. And I think from my perspective, I think PMI kind of did it for us in many ways. Well, especially through PMI version 6. Certainly that one is the one that I know the best. And that is that we kind of had a project closure at the end of each major phase. And so it's easy to do a project closure at the end of the project when you've been doing one at the end of every phase. So you always know what's happening, and you're ticking and tying and dotting the I's and crossing the T's at the end of every phase. And I suppose you can extrapolate that in the Agile world to the end of every sprint, or certainly the end of every program increment.
So think about this. Think about this. In the early days, we thought about the end of the project in traditional project management. That's the
Correct.
close.
Yeah.
Now, in the 6th edition, we were talking about phase gates.
Yes.
It's a decision at the end of phase. Well, guess what? In the 7th edition, all of a sudden, we're talking about governance, which means pick a point at any part of the schedule and make a decision there and collect data and analyze. And so this can be a constant activity, just like you're doing everything else. It's based on the needs of the project and the needs of the organization and the needs of you to make sure you're ensuring proper transition and there's no headaches or hiccups at the end of the project.
Well, in fact, let's take a look at just one aspect. Let's take a look at the lessons learned process. If I wait to the end of the project, and my projects were anywhere from 2 years to 6 years long. So can you imagine at the end of 2 years sitting down with your team and saying, okay, we're going to spend the afternoon doing lessons learned. Now, back in January of 2 years ago, do you remember? No.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. So unless you're doing lessons learned project closure tasks as you go along, you will never get a proper lessons learned. And I suspect that pertains to other deliverables of the project, other tasks as well.
Yeah, I actually learned this when I was working up in the Pacific Northwest on a series of projects with 6 or 7 clients. It was across a year and a half. We'd often get together as a group for dinner, and over dessert, we talk about the day and the week, and we talk about what we learned. And I was thinking to myself, if I just had a notepad, and I was thinking, you know what? This is the best environment to do that. And why do we wait? We're relaxed, we're confident, we don't feel like we're stressed. We can actually be thoughtful, and it's close enough to learning that. That's beautiful. And that's when it clicked for me, exactly what you said. Can we do this on a semi-regular schedule such that we don't miss these things that we can forget over weeks or months?
Well, and what I'm also learning from Agile, and I do not pertain or purport myself to be an Agile expert in any way, but having now been on a couple of Agile projects, what I notice is that a lot of the ceremonies that are built in are a retrospective. And some can be at the sprint level, some more in depth at the PI level, at the program increment level. But those retrospectives are an incredible opportunity to say, okay, this is what we did well in the last sprint. Let's continue. This is where we fell down. Let's improve that for the next sprint. So I think built-in ceremonies, they've also recognized in the Agile process that that's so important.
And we can adopt those in traditional projects really easily. It's not something that we're not allowed to do. And there's another part of lessons learned in the training material for preparing for the PMP exam. They talk about not just a lessons learned register, but they talk about a lessons learned repository, contributing to this bigger knowledge base than just your individual project. And, not just for the benefit of other projects, but the benefit of the organization. And this is where the real wisdom of lessons learned come from. This is where we can actually improve not just, operational improvement, but status quo itself.
Well, and that's what we learned as contracting organizations, as system integrators. Because you would bring together a group of people for a short period of time, fixed period of time, and eventually those people would be then dispersed to other projects. Why not take the lessons learned to those other projects? And the only way to do that is what you just said, is to build up that lessons learned repository.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you can always,
and that was one of the reasons for the advent of project management offices, was to actually be the host of some type of a knowledge base for good practice. It also, PMOs also came about to create some sense of centralization and standardization of project management. But those two ideas, that knowledge base and that standard approach to PM, go hand in hand.
well, and we've been focusing on lessons learned, but because that is probably one of the more significant aspects of project closure. But these exact same ideas apply to other aspects. For example, in terms of archiving your deliverables. There's those deliverables. If I'm doing another project that looks like the last one, I can grab 2 or 3 deliverables from the last one and not copy paste, but certainly use those as guidelines for my next one. So again, the deliverables are useful on the project that I delivered them for, but they're equally useful to the project I'm about to deliver. So again, one aspect of lessons learned is to maintain that project deliverable inventory.
And that leads me to another question here. So you're in a new project, you're getting into planning and estimating. What can you do in your planning and estimating to actually ensure a real good project closure?
This is going to sound trite, but it's a good thing to plan and estimate those particular tasks.
Yeah.
So whether I'm in Agile or Waterfall, whatever I am in, put in those periodic aspects of project closure right in my project schedule, so that I know when I hit this milestone, there is a project closure activity that follows that. And it's part of my estimate, it's part of my schedule, it's part of my cost, but it's certainly part of what I need to do to keep on improving as an organization.
There's a lot of administrative duration and costs that need to be considered when we're building our plan. And again, I think this is one of the reasons why many project closures are pretty unpredictable.
Well, because they're done haphazardly and in a rush at the end if they're not thought of all the way through.
Exactly. We're leading, it seems like we're having the same conversation across all of these concepts, and it's leading to one big thought. If you're preparing for closure at the beginning, you have a higher probability of hitting what you desire at the end.
What's the old adage? It's better to have a goal and miss it than not to have a goal and hit it.
Yeah.
So the goal being that at the time that I close my project, I've also got all of the project closure activities lined up and in place. It's just we're project managers, we're planners, we can do that. It's easy.
And again, it's just like a restaurant when you're locking up the front door of the restaurant. It's a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction when you look and you say, yep, everything's ready for tomorrow, and I don't have to worry about anything tonight. Yeah. There are very few times in a project manager's career where they have that sense of satisfaction.
When I was going through high school and through college, I had the opportunity of spending my summers working for contracting organizations. And when I say contracting, I mean building organization, not IT. So, and what I would watch is these contractors, even the way that they put their tools away at the end of the day to make the next day easy to start off with, was just, I'd watch and wonder and say, why is he doing that? Oh, that's the first thing he's going to do is grab that one in the morning. And just watching how, people who are organized and efficient just naturally, I think, almost put these sorts of activities in place.
It's amazing. When I was working for a transportation company in the mid to late 90s, they did the same thing, and they in fact had an entire organization called industrial engineering that said, if you're going to use a tool, a lot of the time it's going to be right here.
Yeah.
Now, if you have another tool you're not going to use so often, put it over there, still within reach, but not as close. And that way it'll make more logical sense and it'll be less effort. And this mindset, I know it's, again, it's administrative and it's frustratingly detailed, but depending on the project and depending on the work environment, this can actually not just save you work, but it can save you lots and lots of stress.
Oh, huge. Can you imagine? So thinking of project closure, again, working for the contractors I worked for, the end of the day, each day was basically the closure for that day. But can you imagine showing up at the work site the next day and going, where's my hammer?
but
spending
don't we
spending 15 minutes looking for a hammer? What a waste.
But don't we do that as project managers? You know, when we're entering a new project, you say, where's that template? I know I had it.
Yeah.
Why am I not that organized? Why don't I have a copy paste set of regular templates, and then I have not so regular templates that I have an archive over here? Why don't I think like that so I can just hit the ground running without even worrying whether I'm ready or not?
The perfect analogy. And by the way, it took me a long time, but I have finally developed that. I can grab a change request form. I can grab a status request. I can grab almost any kind of form I need and then work with my client and manipulate it to the format that he or she would like. So yeah, it took me a while, but it works.
And we forget, just like how construction people have their hammers and saws, we have templates and information and knowledge. And we must be, cognizant that when I say mise en place, I mean, where's that knowledge? I have my most critical books here. I have a bunch of books here. And the most common knowledge I use, I put right by my project files so I can access them very quickly. This is, again, this whole concept, this is where I got that concept of mise en place. Everything has its place. It's incredibly disciplined and it's painful to manage, but at the same time, it saves so much effort and stress.
Well, and here's, like you, I've learned the same thing from having made the mistakes on previous projects and not doing proper closures. But if you were to walk in the office in which I'm standing right now, I have my desk, my stand, my credenza, my library organized so that 90% of the time everything is at my fingertips. I don't have to even get out of my chair.
Right.
And what's interesting is if I have to get out of my chair to get something, I frustrate myself because I think I'm feeling inefficient right now because I had to get out of my chair.
Well, and not only that is the thing that goes in my head when I have to move and look is, how many times am I going to do this the next time? And is there value in bringing that book or that information or that knowledge closer to where I work?
Right. I've even learned in project closures, even the kinds of furniture we had, cubicles and that sort of thing we had gotten for our staff. We even improved on those because we would ask our staff, how's the working environment? So, we think of project closure in terms of deliverables, transition. We don't think of a lot of these other things. And I mean, even where's the water cooler? Right?
Exactly. So bottom line is, we have the transition of the deliverable, the closure of the work of the deliverable, but we also have the closure of the work of project management itself. And we have that administrative closure that needs almost as much attention as the deliverable does.
Yeah. One of the things I learned early on, and this came as a result of talking to my staff with project closure, a lot of our work, especially in the waterfall methodology, we had to spend several weeks, if not months, doing requirements gathering. And that meant having the subject matter experts from our end user organization working directly with our IT staff in developing those requirements. And so much time was wasted on some of those early projects and traveling to a central location to have our meetings. And it didn't take me long to figure out that when we put in our bids for the next project, we required co-location of subject matter experts from the user staff with our IT staff, so that literally they were housed together in the same place. And it took 5 seconds to move to the meeting and do requirements definition, as opposed to an hour driving across town.
That makes so much sense.
But again, if we hadn't done a project closure activity and talked to our staff in terms of what maybe frustrated them, we would never have learned that.
Right, right. So
sounds simple, doesn't it, Tim?
Well, it's simple in retrospect.
It is. Yeah.
It's simple through the rear view mirror. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one other piece that I see. How much of the project closure do you do just through your own efforts? And how much of the project closure is necessary for other people to help you with?
If I had to do a percentage, probably 80-20, 80 for people that work with me, 20 for myself. And as a project manager, there's things that a project manager just naturally has to do. They have to manage the invoicing. They have to manage the final, reviews of staff. They have to manage that sort of thing. But a lot of the, say, deliverables gathering, the inventory, the transition of knowledge from one person to another, all of that can definitely be done by the people who are closest to it and who have working knowledge of those areas.
Yeah.
So 80-20 is probably a good percentage.
So you use that, not just the 80-20, but the whole concept of whoever is closest to that effort actually is more necessary to the completing of that effort. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So if I'm going to transition the training from my staff to the end user community's staff so that they can pick up their ongoing training, I'm not going to have my developers do that. I'm going to have my trainers do it. So yeah, it just makes sense to have those closest to the activity do that closeout transition activity.
Okay, very good, very good.
Does that square with the way you've done it?
Oh yes, oh yes. Again, it's as simple as I go to my engineers for my engineering lessons learned, but I also go to my client-facing team members to actually assist and sometimes even facilitate the closure steps and decisions with the client themselves. It's all dependent on each, the characteristics of each unique project. But like you said, the people closer to that knowledge and those actions are the ones that you're going to need to have help doing it.
And I've, you mentioned the PMO before, Project Management Office. So if I'm working in a large organization that has a centralized project management office, which is basically required to do the closeout activities, I've had the opportunity to work in PMOs, and I can tell you that I still don't have all of the knowledge I need to do closeout. I'm still reaching out to those closest to the activities. So in that situation, the PMO management staff, their responsibility is to make sure everything is organized and everything is completed, but they don't have to actually physically do the activity.
Correct. But they do have a role in it that
Yeah.
you have to have them engaged in. Oh yeah. So we're coming up, getting close to the end of our discussion, but there's one other thing I'd like to talk to you about. Do you have any tricks that you've learned that are just unique to how you approach projects that you find are helpful for you?
I don't know if I have tricks. Can I use the word techniques instead?
Yeah, use techniques.
Yeah. So one of the ones is that we've been talking about pretty much all the way through this entire discussion. It's one of those things where you start closing early and close all the way through, so that when you have to do the final close, a lot of the activities are taken care of. So I think if I were a new project manager, what I would learn from this discussion is always, it's an old adage in terms of, do your work with the end in mind all the time.
Yeah, yeah. What I found was handy is when I was doing a huge volume of projects that were like 6 months to a year long, I found out that if I was doing similar projects, like 3 projects that were similar, I would build its own unique checklist for starting the project and ending the project. And so I wouldn't just have one project checklist. Am I doing this? I'd have for that unique type of work, this, and then closing this. And that seemed to actually help me. That itself was a wealth of knowledge.
Well, and we talked earlier also about deliverables on a project. We don't do deliverables just to get paid. We do deliverables because they actually advance our knowledge of what's required to complete on the project. And I think one of the things there too, in terms of one of the techniques there, is to make sure that our organizational repository for deliverables is well organized, has a solid naming convention so that you can easily pick up the deliverable. You can easily understand who managed that project, so that if you have questions, you can go to that person. And you can easily understand what becomes a great model for the next project that you're about to do. So if you're well organized and you archive deliverables properly, those can be absolutely leveraged for other projects. And
well, not just absolutely leveraged, but leveraged easily.
Easily,
you're setting up basically a knowledge management system, not just a knowledge repository, something that like you said, something that makes the search and the understanding and the retrieval of these lessons learned easier, because this project's lessons learned is next project's organizational process assets.
Can you imagine how much time you save just by, just take a table of contents for a requirements definition deliverable. If I don't have to think through another table of contents ever again, because this one happens to suffice, how much time have I just saved?
Well, and then layer on top of that, I have in just one of my archive folders. This is a cloud folder that's zipped, right? It's not on my computer today, but I can go into it in a moment's notice. And it's probably what? 24, 25 years of project management. And it has basically all the project artifacts of every project I worked on. And if I have an indexing system that allows me to climb down and get exactly what I want through those decades, as well as just the, just the type of knowledge, it's like, this is incredibly valuable. And then think about a group of project managers getting together and do that. That's where it gets really exciting about these lessons learned.
Yeah, I have something similar, or at least of documents that I was allowed to maintain. A lot of the contracts I work on, obviously we couldn't take deliverables with us, even though we had created them, because they didn't belong to us.
Right.
But those that belong to us that we could, they have saved me hours. And I was thinking of we've talked a lot about lessons learned. On one large project, I had actually helped the organization understand the need for, and then went through and developed an entire lessons learned. I happen to be on the organization side, not on the system integrator side. Well, the system integrator got wind of this and wanted to see the lessons learned. And of course, some of them pointed out how we could work better with system integrators. But I was able to take that document to my next project, leverage it, and people thought that I was an incredibly omniscient person because I had this document that we had labored so much on the previous one. But guess what? A lot of the lessons learned were ones that we immediately put in place to avoid pitfalls that we had had on the other projects. So yeah, it's amazing how these archives, these closure reports can help us as we go along. That's probably one of the best techniques in terms of the
Oh
question.
yeah. Oh yeah. And it's funny because we think about this doing for our projects. And when I did a career transition into teaching, I was thinking, am I going to lose this ability to be able to be this impactful with organizing my knowledge and being prepared for new activities? And then I said, no, every class is a new project.
Yeah.
And so what we're thinking of is not just being organized for projects and project management. Well, yes, it is, because everything, to a project manager can be a project. And that in itself was a lesson learned for me.
Yeah. The other thing I learned from project closure reports, and this is working with the federal government, who had a lot of state governments as their clients, was what we would do is we would develop templates of deliverables, the ones that really worked well for the projects that we had been on. And those became artifacts within the bidders library, so that when bidders bid the job, they had to use those artifacts and say, all of our deliverables will look like this. Imagine how that evened out the playing field and made the evaluation of the bidders much easier.
Well, yeah. And on top of it, it eases your personal effort in version control and just general documentation standardization. This is a powerful advice.
And guess what? We now had a common language. Your definition of requirements and the next person's definition of requirements could be far apart, but because you had a common deliverable, they had to be the same for this bid. So it all worked out well for us.
Wow. That is a real good takeaway.
Yeah. Lessons learned, project closure.
So as we're wrapping up today, my most common question at the end of our show is, if we have project managers who are just getting started, what would be, the best initial advice we could give them?
From my perspective, develop that checklist of items that you need to close a project. Sometimes they're contractual, sometimes they're organizational elements. Develop that checklist and then build each of those items into your schedule all along the way.
Yeah. And on top of that, conceptually, understanding that project closure is not something that just happens at the end of the project. It's a constant, iterative activity that if you do it well, you get to sit back and relax and have an extra cup of coffee as everything else concludes.
Well, and the other thing is, we talked a little bit about Agile before. When we did our program increments, we ensured that at the end of every program increment, all of the deliverables were brought up to speed in terms of what was added with that program increment. So again, we had kind of a project closure activity at the end of every program increment, but we made sure our documentation, which is the number one boon of IT people, made sure our documentation was always up to date.
Very good.
Very
good. Well,
good.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I can't wait to see what we're going to get talking next. I know that we're going to be transitioning out of this process domain, and we're going to start talking about some business concepts. And I'm really excited to talk about those. And then after those are done, fairly soon, we're going to be going into a new chapter of this show. And you and I need to start talking about what we're going to be talking about next.
Well, and I think our 100th show isn't that far off. So maybe we should bring noisemakers and whistles and stuff like
And
that.
funny hats. Yeah.
Like funny hats.
And not only that, we need to do a sort of celebration, but we also need to actually, think about how we can in the next chapter of this show add more value and get it out to more of our peers, so they can actually extract lessons learned, and we can have a broader conversation. I'm really looking forward to that.
We can even have a podcast closure at that point.
You know what? That's not a bad idea.
Not a bad
That's
idea.
not a bad idea there at all.
Until next time.
Thanks again, Merv. And thanks everybody for checking in.